Alright guys, now welcome back to episode 16 part B. Now before we start writing code, let us first look at what we want to accomplish here on the home screen. First of all, when the home screen is displayed, either after checking the user authentication state or when coming from one of the authentication screens, login or sign up, we would like to fetch the onboarding data. Now this is a list of suggested user to follow in case the current user hasn't followed anyone yet. And at the same time, we need to send another request to get the first page of post. Now what else do we need to do here on the home screen? Well, we need to be able to follow someone. Like from the list of suggested user, we need to be able to follow some suggested users. We also need to be able to like a post. So in the overall, we are going to need two features for the home screen. We'll need the post feature and also the follows feature. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. Alright, and now because the onboarding section is all about the follow feature, we will start with that feature first. Let me close the Android app module. Now we are mainly going to work in the shared module, and when it's time to go to Android app module, I will tell you. Right, now coming here inside the shared module, we need to go in the common main source set. Now here at the root package level, we need to create a new directory, and we will name this one as follows. The first thing we need to do is to define the models. Since this is going to be used on the home screen and also the other screens like the profile screen and also the followers screen, these models are going to be common. And for that reason, we are going to place them here in the common package. Here under the data directory, we are going to create a new directory we'll name model. In this model directory, we need to create a new Kotlin file. We will name this as remote follows user models. It's inside this file that we are going to define our remote models. Now, the first remote model is the follows params. These are the parameters that we send when we want to follow a user. We need to send the ID of the person that is following and also the ID of the person that is being followed. Don't forget to add the serializable annotation. Below this follows parameter, we're also going to define a new remote model. This one is going to be called as remote follow user. This has the ID, name, bio, image, URL, and is following boolean. And now right below this remote follows user, we need to define another model, and this one is called follows API response data. This is the response body that comes from the server. Now it has a boolean for whether the operation was successful or not. It has a list of follows. Now this may represent a list of followers or a list of following, and then it has a message for when something went wrong on the server side. We are going to define here another model that we are manually going to construct when getting results from the server, so that we have this HTTP status code. Now for the action to follow or to unfollow a user, we have a different response that comes from the server, and for that we need to define here another model. This one is called follow or unfollow response data. Now this is the body response that comes when we send a request to follow or unfollow a user. We also need an HTTP status code when getting this type of response from the server. And for that, we're going to define another model right below this follow or unfollow response data. We have here follow or unfollow API response. That's all the models we need for the follow feature. Coming here under the common main source set. Here in the remote directory where we have our Ktor API class, we are going to create a new Kotlin class. And this one will be named follows API service. Now, the reason I'm putting this follows API service class here in the common and then remote directory is because this API service class will be used across multiple repositories. For example, we're going to use that for the home repository. We are also going to use that for the profile repository, and it will be used for followers and following repository as well. All right, and now in here, we need to define an internal class follows API repository that extends the Ktor API class. And from here, we're going to define all the methods we need to interact with the follow API endpoint. The first method we will define here is a method to follow a user. So we will call this as follow user. It's going to take the user token and also the follows params. Now the follows params is this first model we defined here inside remote follows user models.get. This needs to return follow or unfollow API response Now here first we will define the HTTP response, and we'll call client that we have from the Ktor API class. We'll call client.post, since this is going to be a post HTTP method. Now from here we need to set the endpoint, the body, and also the token. So our endpoint will be / follows, and then follow, because this is the endpoint to follow a user. Then we set the body to be the follows params, and then we need another extension method to set the token. So we will define that here inside Ktor API class. Right below this endpoint extension, we need to define another extension function on the HTTP request builder, and that is to set the token. Now let's close Ktor API and come back here. After HTTP response, we now need to build follow or unfollow API response. And this requires the code that we get from http response.status, and for the data we'll call http response.body. Now since we are using Kotlin X utilization, calling this body will convert the http response body to our to follow or unfollow response data. Alright, and now for the unfollow user method, we'll go a little faster because what changes here is just the endpoint. We are not going to post on the follow endpoint, but on the unfollow endpoints. Okay, so as for now, we will need another method that is getFollowable users. Now this is going to take a token and also the user ID for which we want to suggest some users to follow. The server is responsible for knowing if the current user hasn't followed anyone yet, and in the case this current user has already followed some people, the server is going to return an empty list for those suggested followings. Now here we need to define another constant, current user parameter. First, let's define this constant Kotlin object. Now here inside common, we need to create, I guess we already have the util, yeah. Now here inside the util directory, let's create a new Kotlin file, a new Kotlin object that we'll name as constant. Okay, so here we need to paste our first constant, and that is a user ID parameter. Okay, we can close this and import constant the user ID parameter. As for now, we will stop here with follows API service. Alright, and now next we need to define a domain model, and we are going to do that. Let me first close this. Okay, we already have the data directory. We need to create a domain directory. Now in this domain directory, we will create another directory for our models. So this directory is going to be named as model. Now in this model directory, we need to create follows user. And this is going to be a data class follow user with ID, name, bio, image URL, and this boolean is following. Alright, and now that we have our API service class and all the models, we now need a repository. Now for the repository, we will go in the feature directory, and here we're going to define a directory called data, and another directory in the follows directory that we call domain. Now in this domain directory is where we are going to define our follows repository interface. This follows repository interface for now has only two methods. The first one is called getFollowable users. Now this returns result of type list of follows user. Now the second method is follow or unfollow user. This of course need the ID of the person that we want to follow or unfollow, and whether we are following or unfollowing. So that's why we have this should follow boolean, and then it returns result of type boolean. Alright, and now we have our follows repository interface. We are now going to provide an implementation for that, and the implementation will go here inside the data directory. So let's create a new Kotlin class file. In here, we need to define an internal class follows repository implementation. Now this class needs the follow API service. It's also going to take user preferences, and lastly dispatcher. Of course, we need to extend follows repository. Here we need to override the getFollowable users and the follow or unfollow method. Alright, so let's start with this getFollowable users. Now, as always, we first need to switch the operation to the background thread. So for that, we call this with context dispatcher.io. Alright, so in here we need a try catch block. Now, at first, we need to get the current user data. So for that we call user preferences dot get user data. After getting the current user data, then we're going to make our API call. So we define this API response and we call follow API service dot get followable users, and we provide the token of the current user and also the ID. After getting the API response, we are going to analyze the HTTP status code. Now, if we have HTTP status code okay, then we need to call API response dot data dot follows the list of remote follow user, and we need to map that to the domain follow user. We need to create or to add this method inside our remote follow user. So coming here inside remote follows user models.get, we need to scroll up here and we need to add a method here to convert the remote follow user to the domain follow user. So this method is going to be simple. We call it to domain follow user. Right, now let's go back inside follow repository implementation. Now you can see that the error is gone. Now, if we had, for example, a bad request, if the response code was http status code dot bad request, now here we need to return result dot error. Now, for the message here, feel free to add a fine-grained error handling mechanism. For instance, you could define a seed class for different error cases and return that instead, to let the view model decide the current message to show to the user, and that would allow you to show error messages, for example, in different languages based on current user settings. Here in my case, to make things simple, we are just going to return the error message that comes from the server. Now, after the bad request, we may also encounter this forbidden. Now, this HTTP status code is returned when the user has already some followings, and in that case we need just to return that the operation was successful but the data comes as an empty list. Now here I will just say in any other case, so we have this S block, we just need to return result.error, and then again we will just send the message that comes directly from the server. All right, now here we may catch an IO exception, and in that case we are just going to return error no internet. Now let's just define a constant for this. So let's go inside the util package of the common directory. Now right below user ID parameter, we need to paste this constant no internet error, and we can replace this. Alright, so that's it for get followable users. Let's work on follow or unfollow user. Alright, now to follow or unfollow a user, let me paste the code and then explain. Alright, so here is the code to follow or unfollow a user. First of all, we are switching our operation to the IO thread. Then we have our try block, and inside this try block, the first thing that we want to do is to get the current user data. Then we are making follows params by taking the current user data as the follower, because we need to construct these follows params that takes in a follower and a following. And for the following, we are going to pass this followed user ID. Right, so after constructing these follows params, then we need to make our API request depending on whether we are following or unfollowing the current user. That's why we added this should follow boolean. Now, the API response will be defined, for example, if we are following, if should follow, then we need to call follow API response dot follow user, and we will be passing the token and also the follows params. If the action was to unfollow the user, in that case we will call follows API response dot unfollow user, and here we pass also the same parameters. So after making the API request, we are going to check if the HTTP status code is okay. In that case, we will return a result.success. And of course, the data is just that boolean that we got from the server, which should be normally successful. And then in any other case, we are just going to return a result.error. For the data, we are returning false because we need to return a result of type boolean. Now, I'm just returning false here instead of null. We could also return null because this is nullable, but I just choose to return false. And for the message, we are just taking the server message that is coming inside this API response. And then for the catch block, we can catch IO exception, and in that case we know that this is probably an internet connection error, so we just need to return this no internet error. And for any other case, we just need to return the message that comes from the server. That is going to allow us to do some debugging, but in a production app, normally you should return a known error here. All right, now we are done with follows repository implementation. So after the follows repository implementation, we need to define use cases. And as for now, for the follows feature, we will have two use cases. The first will be get followable users use case, and the other one will be follow or unfollow use case. Come back here inside the domain directory. Here we need to define a new, or here we need to create a new directory, and this one we'll name it as use case. Now in this use case directory, let's create our first Kotlin file. We'll name this as a get followable users use case. You don't need to put this use case at the end, but that's what I just like to do sometimes. All right, so select file and hit enter. And so in here, we are going to define a class get followable use case. Now we need to make this as a Koin component because we are going to directly inject the repository here. This is the vol repository, and we call this a by inject to inject the follows repository. Override the operator invoke methods. Now this should return a result of list of follows user, and we are just calling here repository.getFollowable users. All right, so let's close this, and we are now going to create our second use case, and this one is going to be named as follow or unfollow use case. And again, this follow or unfollow user use case is going to be made as a Koin component, and then we inject the follows repository, and we also override the invoke operator methods. We just return repository.follow or unfollow this user. Alright guys, and now we are done with the follows feature, at least for today's episode. Let's now start with the post feature, and you will notice that I'll be more straight for the remaining part of today's episode because of course I assume that you have watched the entire episode up until now, and what we're going to do is not really different from what we've done for the follow feature. Okay, now go ahead and expand the common main source set. Let's create a new directory. This will represent the post feature. Now, we will come to this post directory in a moment, but for now, let's go again inside the common directory. And now, inside this model directory, we are going to create a new Kotlin file where we will be putting all the remote models. This one, we are going to name it as remote post models. And of course, the first model will be remote post. Now for the remote post, we will have the post ID, the caption, the image URL, the created date, the likes count, the comments count, the user ID, the username, the user image URL, and a boolean for whether the current user has already liked this post or not. That will come from the server, and another boolean to tell us if this post belongs to the current user. Now for the HTTP response body, we'll have this model here, the post API response data, where we have success, a list of posts, and a message for in case something went wrong on the server. And like we did for the follow feature models, we will create another model here, post API response, and that now this time includes the HTTP status code. All right, and now we need another Kotlin file for the post likes models. So create another Kotlin class file, and this one will be named as remote post like models. Now the models here in the remote post likes models.get, we have like params. Now this is the body that we will send in our request when a user wants to like a post, and this model here, like response data. Now this is the response body that will come from the server. It has a success and a message, and then to include the HTTP status code, we will build this like API response manually when receiving response from the server. All right, now let's close this. Come here in the remote directory. We are going to create our API service class. So it will be named as post API service. And of course, we need to declare here an internal post API service class that extends Ktor API. Now in this post API service class, the first method will be to get feed posts. Now this method takes in a user token, the current user ID, the page, and the page size. All right, and now we need to define these constants, but what you can see for the HTTP response, after we call client.get, since this is going to be an HTTP get method, we have the endpoint, and that points to /post and then feed. Here we need to pass some query parameters, the current user, the page, and the page size, and we also setting the token here. After that, we return post API response, where we pass the code as http response.status, and for the data we are calling http response.body. All right, now let's go inside constants, and we're going to paste our constants. Right below no internet error, here we're going to paste this constant for the current user, the page query, and the page size. All right, so that's it for this get feed post. Now below get feed post, we have two similar methods. The first one is to like a post. This is taking the user token and the likes params. We build our HTTP response by calling client.post. We are posting to /post, then likes, and then add a new like. We set the body to be likes params and the token to be the user token. Then we build this like API response where we provide the code and the body. The same thing is being done here also for when we want to unlike a post. Now this time the endpoint is /post, likes, and remove, but the remaining code is the same. All right, that's it also for post API response, at least for this episode. All right, and now in the domain directory, here inside the model directory, let's create a new Kotlin class file, and this is going to be named as post. Now this is the domain post model. Of course, here we are going to have a data class for our post where we have pretty much the same attribute as for the remote post. Now next, let's go here at the post directory. Let's create two new directory. The first one is going to be named as data, and the other one will be the domain. Now here inside the domain, we need to create post repository interface. This post repository interface also has two methods: get feed post, like post. Now we need an implementation for post repository, and we will do that here inside the data directory. Now create post repository implementation. Now for post repository implementation, of course, we are going to define an internal class post repository implementation that extends post repository. Now this post repository implementation needs the dispatcher, the user preferences, and also the post API service class. Of course, we need to override get feed post and also like post. All right, so for getting feed post, let me paste the code here and explain. Now first of all, we are switching the operation to the IO thread. Then we have our try block. Inside this try block, we first of all get the user data by calling user preferences.getUserData. Then we make our API call. So we call post API service.getFeedPost. Here we need to pass the token, userdata.token, the current user ID, userdata.id, and the page size and the page argument passed here. Now after we get this API response, then we are going to check for the API response code. When it's okay, we want to return success, and the data will be API response.data.post.map to the main post. Now, of course, we now need to define this to the main post method inside our remote post model. So remote post model is, what is it? Okay. Remote post model is here. Now let's define here a method to return a domain post model. Alright guys, now for the created date, we are going to create this date formatter Kotlin object to do just some simple formatting to convert the date that we're getting from the server to the one that we want to display in our posts. Now I'm not going to go much deeper into how to format all this, and we are going to use the JetBrains Kotlin X datetime library. So open the build.gradle.getcs file of the shared module. Now in the common main source set, come here in the dependencies block, and below the data store preferences core, I'm going to paste a dependency for Kotlin X at datetime and then click sync now. Alright, so the build is done. Let's close this. Now come here inside the util directory. Let's create a new Kotlin object. We will call this as a date formatter. Select object and hit enter. Now in here we're going to define this method parse date. This get a date string, and it's also going to return a string. Now here, of course, let's call this try catch because trying to parse this date string may throw an error. So we need to surround that inside a try block. Now in here, we will have this val parse date, and we need to call a local datetime dot parse. Now the input is going to be the date string. Now I'm going to paste this code here. Now don't worry much about all this. You will see what the result looks like when we start retrieving our post. But for now, just copy this code from my GitHub repository. Alright, now here we will catch an error. It's going to be an illegal argument exception if we could not parse this date string, and in that case we just need to return the date string itself. Now in the comment section, let me know if you have a better way of doing all this. Let me close this, and now we need to import this date formatter. Alright, now let's go back inside post repository implementation, and now we need just to provide this unexpected error constant. Let's open constant.kt, and below page size query parameter we'll paste this constant for unexpected error has occurred. Unexpected error has occurred, please try again. Alright, so let's close this. Now let's do the like post method. Now for a like post, here is the code. As usual, we switch to the IO thread, we get the user data, then here we are building these likes params, then we make our API call. After that, we check for the API response.code. If it's HTTP status code, that's okay. In that case, we return success, and the data will be this success that comes from the server. Else, we are going to return result.error. For the data, will pass false. And for the message, we just pass api.data.message. Alright, now next we need use cases. Therefore, let's go back in the domain directory, and we will create a new directory called use case. Let's create our first use case, Kotlin file class, and this one will be named as getPost use case. Of course, this is going to be a simple use case. We just need to make it a Koin component, and then we inject the repository, of course the post repository. Now the invoke operator method need to take in the page and the page size, and returns results list of posts. We call post repository.getFeed post. Now the second use case is going to be a like or unlike post. Let's create a new Kotlin class file, like or unlike post use case. And here we also need to make it Koin component, inject the repository. Now the invoke method takes in a post, and then call repository.like post, where it passes the post ID, and whether the post is liked or not, we just need to toggle the current boolean for this is liked attribute. Alright, now so far we have created a lot of classes. It's time to tell Koin how to provide all these dependencies before we move on the Android side for the UI layer. So let's open shared modules.kt under the DI package. What is that? Now inside common main source set, we have this DI directory, and we need to open shared module.kt. Alright, so here we need some modules. We have the post module and also the follows module. For the post module, we have the post API service, the gets post use case, like post use case. Then we have the post repository, and we are providing post repository implementation. For the follows module, we have follows API service, get followable user use case, follow or unfollow use case, and then follows repository. All right, now we need to provide them to this returned list. We have post module and also follows module. That's it for episode 16 part B. In episode 16 part C, we will be on the Android side to start implementing the onboarding section, and then in the last part we will do the post feature on the home screen. Let me close this and see you in episode 16 part C.